Welcome everyone to this webinar from Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners. Those of you who don't know, we merged earlier this year and have not yet announced an exciting new name. So the two companies have come together, and we were jointly at COP in earlier this month, and so are delighted to have Jonathan here to give a debrief on what happened and what that means for business. We were at COP, as I said, as were many people. We had a very, very busy time, which included Jonathan speaking on a session with our good friends and partners, the Arbor Day Foundation. And we also held a session with Vera, the organization that runs the Verified Carbon Standard, and some excellent speakers about the way in which the voluntary carbon market and host countries can work together to raise ambition and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that was alongside a series of events that we held with our broadcaster clients. We work with several broadcasters in the UK and put together a series of events around how the role of broadcasting in talking about climate change. So if any of you were there, I hope you were able to attend those to hear about, for instance, how comedy can talk about climate change, or sport, or soap operas. And if you weren't there and are interested, they are all available online, and those links are available on our website. So it was a full session for a full 2 weeks for us, and more particularly for Jonathan, probably, who was there for the whole time, roaming the Blue Zone and talking to everyone about what was going on. Jonathan, I don't want to call him a veteran because that would be unfair, but he has been to many COPs and he understands the shenanigans that can go on there and can help translate that into language that makes sense to some of us who don't understand those more technical details. Before I hand over to Jonathan, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We have, this is one of our most popular webinars. We've got a huge registration list, so it's delighted to have you all joining us from all over the world, and particularly those who are about to embark on their Thanksgiving break. If you have questions, please use the Q&A panel on the webinar to submit your questions, and I'll be interspersing those throughout Jonathan's talk, and then we'll also have some time at the end. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to start with a poll. So we would like your views on where you stand in terms of some of the people who spoke about COP or at COP. So we have a few people who were famous for things that they said, and with whom of these people, with which of these people do you most strongly identify? So first would be Greta Thunberg, well known for her blah, blah, blah comment. Second would be an Oxford University professor called Miles Allen, commenting on the fact that we actually have made quite good progress, because who would have thought that the idea of net zero would become so commonplace now, when 10 years ago it would have been considered radical. Thirdly, Alok Sharma, who set expectations that COP is not about one big solution, but it's about a building block. Fourthly is Microsoft founder, Bill Gates, who is talking about the innovation that is needed to get us to the goal that we need to achieve. And fifth is Mary Robinson, previous Irish Premier and climate justice campaigner, who was disappointed about the ambition that was demonstrated by leaders at COP. So which of those people do you most strongly identify with? And that poll is coming up now. If you could place your votes. And we'll just wait for a few minutes for those votes to come in.
Rebecca, maybe I can just, give, while people are thinking about their votes, I just want to say that I would like to give my vote of thanks to Glasgow. What a friend, it was the friendliest COP that I'd ever attended. The security guards, everybody was absolutely charming. I think Glasgow really did itself proud, but I'm damn sure, and I know this from a couple of Glaswegians that I've spoken to, they're very happy to see the back of everyone.
And
anyway,
Jonathan, I think that's a very good comment, because I have not really discovered Glasgow before and absolutely fell in love with it as a city. And I know there have been a lot of comments about the amount of police there were security at COP. But from my experience, they were extremely friendly. And I think you and I commented that it reminded me a little bit of the 2012 Olympics in London, that there was, in fact, it seemed like quite a nice atmosphere, and they were on a bit of a charm offensive, even though there were plenty of them there. Right, I'm hoping that we can see now the results of this poll, which I can't see yet. I'm hoping they will come up now. So there we go. Interesting.
oh, wow.
So we have quite a large number are on the Mary Robinson side. This is, a dereliction of duty. That there wasn't nearly enough ambition. But interestingly, not so many agreeing with Greta's blah, blah, blah. So sort of sense of it wasn't all blah, blah, blah and meaningless, but there's a long way to go to demonstrate the ambition and the leadership that we really need. So that's sort of, I think, an interesting set of results. I thought everyone would agree with Bill Gates, if I'm honest. So with that, Jonathan, I am going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. And if we can have the next slide. I thought what I might do is just start off with just to remind everybody that we've been at this issue for 30 years, started in 1992 with the UN Framework Convention. And then there've been a variety of COPs that have, in 97, formulated the Kyoto Protocol and the Marrakesh Accords. In 2001, translated that into a rule book. Copenhagen, of course, the failure to replace Copenhagen. So we kicked the can down the road to 2020 with the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015. And along the way, a couple of important COPs at Katowice and, of course, Glasgow. But I was really surprised to see the data that was put forward by the Perspectives Group, an advisory group in Switzerland, on just the attendance results for Katowice, Madrid, Copenhagen, Paris, and Glasgow. I thought that with the COVID restrictions that there would be, a significant drop in attendees, but it just about topped 40,000 people. And, a couple of pictures there. I think the one on the right, one of the demonstrations working its way into Glasgow Green on the Sunday. Really large crowds of people. It did feel like it probably were 40,000 people. And certainly within the halls, the negotiating halls, it was rather wonderful, slightly scary, to be with so many people again, and having the chance to interact with them all. So a lot of building anticipation and effort. Next slide. Now, Rebecca, you might have mentioned that the two of us are also wearing our, look smart black roll top uniform, actually held a pre-COP webinar just before we all went up to Glasgow. And one of the things that I used there to sort of set out the scene was this rubric of ambition, quality, and integrity. You need all three in equal measure to deliver impact, climate impact. We need the ambition, which we've got now with the Paris Agreement's 1.5. We need quality of NDCs, of carbon projects, mitigation projects, carbon credit standards. And then we need the integrity of all the players. We're all in a bit of a prisoner's dilemma. Unless we work together, we're not going to solve this. So it's the integrity with which we take action that all adds up to impact. So if we use this rubric as a way to sort of examine what actually happened in Glasgow, next build, please. When it comes to ambition, and I think this reflects Professor Allen's comments. 89% of NDCs, which by the way mean nationally determined contributions, the targets of every country, now have a net zero target. I have to say I agree with Miles Allen. That was unimaginable even 10 years ago. When you add up all those NDCs, and let's remember that these are pledges, these are commitments, they are plans that have yet to be translated into action. But even when you add them up, they're tracking below 2 degrees, which was the Paris Agreement goal, well below 2 degrees, but above 1.5. And the latest data I've seen is that when you add up the NDCs, it was likely to result in a 1.7 degree rise in temperature. There was a commitment among about, I think, 100 or so financial institutions that they have, with 130 trillion under management, that they are going to align their future investments with the transition to net zero. That's a pretty impressive number. I mean, you see a lot of big numbers when we talk climate, billions, millions, but 130 trillion was quite stunning. In the final week, of course, the Chinese premier didn't attend, neither did Russia's, but the US-China declaration that was made in the second week paved the way, in my view, to NDC updates in 2022 and a number of other things because of their willingness to work collaboratively on climate that will really tighten up and improve the prospects of the pledges turning into real action. And then there were a raft of deals, declarations, pledges, more on that later, but literally every day there were probably tens or so of different sectors, different groups, different issues receiving support from what I will call clubs of organizations, entities willing to take action. If we can take the next build, when we look at quality, and by quality, we mean the ability of all of these actions to deliver real impact. What we find is that Article 6 in the Paris Agreement was finalized after 6 years of pretty fraught negotiations. And this is the piece of the Paris Agreement that enables international carbon markets. Actually, it's broader than that. It is the engine of international collaboration for the Paris Agreement, which of course is designed around country pledges. So really significant development there, and very significant improvements in the reporting and transparency. The NDCs, these nationally determined targets, are of highly variable quality across the world's nations, but there were significant improvements in transparency and the accounting frameworks that are going to be used in the future that allow us to add up apples with apples and compare oranges with oranges, not mix the two up. And then there was some talk, not yet fully supported with finance, for capacity building, agreed for developing economies. And then the final part of this structure, the integrity piece, the integrity of all nations' commitments to deliver 100 billion per year to LDCs by 2020 was not supported by delivery of that funding, and that speaks very much to Mary Robinson's statement, by the way, and I'm not surprised that it got a lot of support from this audience. Delayed concrete funding for adaptation, loss, and damage, another issue, two sets of issues which really do affect many of the developing economies. Unresolved relationship between voluntary action amongst non-state actors and the Paris Agreement, but more on that later. But increasingly well-funded environmental NGO initiatives to define and track integrity. So there's a real laser focus on what integrity means. And thankfully, a lot of effort going into defining better standards, better safeguards, better guardrails and guidance on that. Next slide. So quickly now, just to go through, and by the way, these 5 issues that I'm going to come up now and just speak to briefly were the questions that we asked in the pre-COP pre-COP webinar. Will nationally determined contributions deliver 1.5? There's a commitment to strengthening 2030 NDCs. In other words, some indices went right out beyond 2030. Some, they use different timeframes, so it's quite hard to add them up. But now there's an agreement that we have to have NDCs to 2030 by the end of 2022. Common end dates, 10-year plans updated every 5 years. Now that might sound very simple, but that didn't reflect how the previous set of NDCs looked. Improvements may not prevent the overshoot of a 1.5 target. More on that later. Next item, next question. Can progress be accurately measured and reported? Now on this one, there was a lot of technical work, and I won't go into the technicalities of this. Significant progress on common reporting protocols, which means that it will be possible to judge whether countries are living up to their NDCs and whether the NDCs all add up to a solution. The next stocktake, COP, will be 2023. So improved targets by 2022, and then an adding up of those COP28 in the United Arab Emirates in 2023. So good progress there. Next one. Will Article 6 negotiations establish a robust mechanism to increase finance for mitigation? Well, Article 6.4 establishes the basis of a new clean development mechanism. Most of you online will know that that was a flexible mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol that allowed countries and, in fact, non-state actors to fund mitigation projects around the world. There was also agreed a 2% cancellation of carbon credits that are going to be issued, that may be issued under 6.4 to deliver overall mitigation of global emissions. Because one of the things about offsetting is that it gives you a net zero-sum game. But with this cancellation, and that figure may rise in the future, we do genuinely get a tamping down of emissions. Next point. Will developed nations come good on their climate finance commitments? But I've already said that we've failed to do so, and there are no provisions yet for loss and damage, and that's subject to future work. But transactions under the 6.4 article, the new version of the clean development mechanism, will generate an off-take tax of 5% for the adaptation fund, and there'll be more work done on that. Number 5, the last one. Will transformative system change replace incrementalism? So a lot of what's gone on in the COPs in the past is, a tightening up of reduction targets here, a percentage point there, here and there. And as Bill Gates indicated with his quote, we really are relying very heavily on deep innovation to transform our economy. And did this COP deliver that? There were some interesting displays in the green zone of some interesting technologies and initiatives. But when it comes to the work of the COP, maybe, if the multitude of aligned pledges and commitments and declarations deliver. And again, I'll pick that up later. Next slide.
Jonathan, can I quickly ask you a question? And you might be about to come onto this, so apologies if I'm jumping ahead. But when it comes to the cancellation of the credits under the CDM, do you think that's going to be replicated in the voluntary carbon market so that it has the same sort of
overall mitigation,
the same sort of overall claim about mitigation?
That is an interesting concept that has been raised on a number of occasions. I would say that the guidance that WWF and BCG put out around corporate guidance on voluntary action implies that going well beyond neutrality or net zero is really going to be desirable, because it's absolutely one thing we can be sure of is that not everybody's going to meet their targets, certainly not at the same time and not by 2050. So I think that's an interesting concept. A number of our clients will feel, hey, we're acting way ahead of regulation and beyond requirements, so we'd be paying twice. But I have to say that climate leadership is being redefined, and that could well be the case. Could we go back to that next slide? Yeah. So the future of the voluntary action, and in fact, Rebecca, your question was very timely because I'm sort of going to dive into this a bit. So delivery of the Paris Agreement's goal is, as I mentioned, built on an aggregate of nationally determined contributions of each party or country to the Paris Agreement. So the delivery mechanism is countries. That's sort of built into the Paris architecture. Next point. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which I've already mentioned, I'm just going to unpack that a moment because this is where voluntary action meets compliance. So there are a number of articles in there, and there are 3 that I'll call out. 6.2 sets out the rules for the transfer of emission reduction units, called ITMOs, internationally transferable mitigation outcomes, between parties, in other words, between countries, through corresponding adjustments to maintain the integrity of climate accounting. So, we know that if we work internationally and collaboratively, we'll get further, faster, and with less cost. But if we start having countries fund emission and mitigation outcomes in one country, not their own, because it's cheaper to do it there, and transfer that and account that in their NDCs, then our double entry accounting is required to make sure that we don't double count these efforts. And that's what Article 6 is all about. 6.4, as I've mentioned, is the successor to the Clean Development Mechanism, which enables finance for mitigation activities through trade and retirement of carbon credits, quite specifically. And then Article 6.8 says we don't have to use markets everywhere. We use everything we can. And so non-market approaches for cooperation is encouraged as well. Next bullet. So what happened at this COP is that host countries, up until this COP, I would say that voluntary action, voluntary carbon markets have operated somewhat separately to the compliance markets. But COP26 signals the connection of the two. But the host countries, because they are remember, they are the structure, the entity that drives compliance, have the authority to decide whether emission reductions that are funded within their borders are used to deliver against national targets, in other words, their NDC, or whether they're prepared to sell them for international mitigation purposes. For example, the aviation sector's CORSIA offset scheme, carbon neutral growth, or other purposes, which was sort of left undefined. But really, people are assuming that what we are saying is voluntary action. So countries will now be increasingly asked to decide where they want private sector direct investment in their climate strategies and how they'll be used. Next bullet. So voluntary action is being redefined. And I would say that the fact that 89% of countries now have net zero targets means that that's going to have to be translated into policy and regulation. So what used to be climate leadership, carbon neutrality, net zero, has now become climate responsible, because responsible companies will, to de-risk themselves from future regulation, will act ahead of and beyond net zero. And that's what climate leadership will become, and climate responsible will be anticipating net zero. So countries will then decide whether and how to encourage private sector investment within their national mitigation activities, and whether that will be done through the compliance mechanisms of 6.2, or whether it might be done through 6.4, which is voluntary investments financed to mitigation outcomes. Now, standards are going to need to keep abreast of new policies and regulation in order to maintain the integrity of additionality. That's going to be tougher than it was in the past. Stakeholder initiatives, and specifically a civil society supported initiative called the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, the VCMI, will become increasingly important arbiters of high integrity claims, because using instruments, carbon credits, the use of instruments can be, or the application of instruments can be done in different ways. You can help a country meet its mitigation target, its NDC, or go beyond. And those will translate into different claims that corporates will make to signal what it is they're doing in terms of the ambition dimension of climate response. Next bullet. So the new modalities of this converging voluntary and compliance markets will be worked out over the coming 2 to 3 years. So there remains some uncertainty as to the claims and the modalities, but we know in which direction we're going. Next slide. So a couple of you might know me and my personal interest in fungi and the role they play in providing ecosystem stability. And so I use, with some pleasure, this analogy of crops as mushrooms. You know that mushrooms, of course, are just the fruiting body of mycelium, which is actually the plant, the fungus plant, which can stretch literally for tens of kilometers. In fact, the largest living organism, as I understand it, is a fungal mycelium in the United States. So what happens is, of course, the mycelium are very critical in terms of transferring energy signals between living organisms that use the soil to gain access to food and water. And they play an absolutely critical role that's been more, through recent scientific investigation, shows that there's a highly collaborative ecosystem enabled by fungal mycelia underground through the passing of energy, foodstuff, signals about when different parts of the ecosystem are under threat. So mushrooms, fruit, and they revitalize the mycelium, and then they die. And that's why I say COP26 mushroom is dead, but long live the mycelium. Next build, please. And the mycelium, in my view, are all of these declarations that were made and commitments and pledges at COP26 now represent a real burst and pulse of energy that unites sectors, countries, constituencies in action that have been self-declared by these clubs of actors within our broader climate change ecosystem. So I very much look forward to seeing how vibrant all of these pledges, these mycelium, strands of mycelium are, and my expectation though is that they will do a massive amount of lifting that will support the Paris Agreement outcomes. Next slide.
Jonathan, and just another question. So you mentioned.
Shall we go back to the previous slide just while we're doing that? Yep.
Well, and so you mentioned that the definition of leadership will change, and you mentioned that, but nevertheless, the way that the voluntary carbon market is going to function, that's still going to sort of be worked out. The details of how it actually works, and there's things like the VCMI looking at some things. But if a business came to you right now and said, okay, well, what do I have to do to demonstrate leadership rather than responsibility using the voluntary carbon market, what would you say? What would your advice be to, what leadership looks like now?
Wow, okay. So I think that climate responsibility means having a credible plan to get to net zero, which of course is a science-based or science-informed abatement target. There's sort of a hierarchy that everybody knows. And then any unabated emissions, when you reach your science-based target, need to be compensated or neutralized with removals. So the first thing is obviously making sure you've got a plan for that. The question then becomes one of accounting. If you use carbon credits for those removals, or indeed, if you use carbon credits to be carbon neutral for every step of the way towards your net zero target date, which is what leadership would be. Leadership would be taking that continual action. Then the question you got to ask yourself is, am I double counting, or am I supporting a country to meet its target, or am I using additional ambition from that country to provide me with a high integrity, high quality carbon credit against which I can claim neutrality along the way? Now, the issue is that with COP just behind us, the modalities of creating a corresponding adjustment are still being worked out. So I think that what will happen is there'll be clubs of countries that will say, we're not going to wait for that to happen. We're going to encourage private sector direct investment, and we'll promise that when we get to the point where we need one, we'll deliver a corresponding adjustment. There'll be many LDCs, developing economies, that won't be able to provide that assurance just yet, but will need a lot of climate finance. And that's where the Mary Robinson comment comes in. So what I would advise is that we have an eye, we show intention to get the world to a point where every NDC is economy-wide, absolute terms. There's, everybody knows what they're doing in all sectors of the economy. But along the way, we're going to need a transition, and we're going to need to keep our eye on the prize. And the prize is continued increasing finance where it's needed most across the global economy, and make sure that we, at the same time as providing that, encourage countries and engage with countries to make sure that their accounting mechanisms deliver the sort of mitigation outcomes of the highest quality along the way. Next slide. So COP was very intense. So on the Sunday, I took a walk out to Glasgow Green, where tens of thousands, I don't know what the final number was, of people, demonstrators, were lending their voice to more ambition. And this particular banner caught my eye: how many COPs to arrest climate chaos? And I thought that was a fair question to ask, actually. How many COPs will it take to align ambition, quality, and integrity to deliver meaningful impact? Next build. So, we achieved a lot at COP26, but as I've mentioned, and Rebecca, as your question pointed out, there's still work to do. We've removed the uncertainty as to whether we are committed to a target, but that uncertainty has been replaced by certain volatility as we work things out. So the next 3 COPs, these are annual events. The next one in Egypt in 2022 is going to address Mary Robinson's question: adaptation, loss and damage finance, widen the focus from mitigation to adaptation and repair, and make sure that that's supported with reasonable levels of finance. When we get to 2023, the COP28 is going to be somewhere in the United Arab Emirates, beg your pardon, and that's going to be the global stocktake, where we add up all the revised NDCs and track progress against those targets to figure out whether we're closing the gap. And if not, there's going to be a lot of pressure to do so. And then in 2024, 3 years out, there'll be a COP in Eastern Europe, and that will look at finance. The $100 billion that has been promised, everybody recognizes that that needs to be trillions. Trillions if we're really going to make a difference. So in 2024, I think there's going to be a very significant effort to build collaboration more directly around finance. And then my final build, and this would be the final slide, actually, of the final slide. So what I think the final comment that I wanted to make, and in a way, Rebecca, it speaks to your question. COP26, which you can see in the background of this ambition, quality, integrity construct, has done a lot to secure ambition, to deliver quality around the accounting, and has done a little bit towards improving the integrity of these actions. But what we know, hopefully from the mushroom analogy, is that this is the only way we're going to solve this is with a very holistic approach, sort of an ecosystem-wide approach. So we deliver impact when these 3 work in concert, and when we keep our focus on the prize, which is impact. And I'm just going to reiterate again that I think responsible and climate and climate leadership are going to play very important roles in doing so. And I think it's going to be very important to make sure that while we navigate the next 3 years to hopefully getting to absolute certainty on the modalities, not on everything, that we continue to focus on delivery of finance to great projects, delivering mitigation outputs, outcomes, and against the SDGs where they're most needed. And I think that the work that we do, and as a combined unit of Natural Capital Partners and Climate Care, is very much focused on continuing the flow of finance and the impact. And we couldn't do that without our clients. It's actually our clients that are funding that, providing the real energy in that mycelium. So I hope this has been a useful summary of COP26, but I am on the optimistic edge of the scale. I think we've laid down a solid foundation. I think many of the organizations I know are on this call, on this webinar, are really doing fantastic work, and our thanks to them. That's my formal bit.
So thank you, Jonathan. So there's a couple of questions. One of them is quite a, well, they're both quite, these couple of questions are quite technical. So one of them is, what's the impact? You've sort of covered this, but very specifically, what's the impact of Article 6, the new Article 6, on the voluntary carbon market, in particular jurisdictional red?
Okay. So, you know, that's a great question, and I'm going to avoid the temptation to get very technical on it. But basically, in the past, before we got to the Paris Agreement and the completed rule book, the voluntary carbon market has really just gone, and developers, project developers, have been able to move into any country and set up a project. And I wouldn't say without any consideration with national priorities, but certainly not defined by national priorities. So there is a move. When I said that, you know, countries are going to be playing a much more critical role in defining where, when, and how they want their finance. So what that, I'm going to interpret jurisdictional nested red is an example where individual red projects are going to have to find their place within the national priorities of that country. And although that's been very critical development for RED Plus because of the issues of leakage and accounting and setting baselines, and again, I'm going to avoid the temptation of being too technical on this, it was very urgent to sort of solve that problem, and that's been done. And in fact, the Leaf Coalition, which was one of the mycelium that I mentioned, has done quite a lot of work with Winrock to define, as has Vera actually, the other standards body, to define the jurisdictional nested red approach. My sense is that's going to become more of the norm across other kinds of methodologies and interventions. So a country might sort of say something like, we would welcome private sector direct finance into off-grid solar energy in this part of the country where we know we don't have the ability to build a renewable grid. So that, in a sense, is providing a jurisdictional steer of a priority and directing the sort of projects that have been our bread and butter to very specific areas of that nation's climate response. Did I answer the question directly enough?
I think so. Okay. I'm going to say you did. And I think, in fact, that probably answers another question we have, but I'm going to say it just to make sure you feel you've answered it, but which was, so an outcome of COP26 is that countries will own carbon reductions from any mitigation projects within their own country, and they decide how much of it will contribute to their NDC, and that amount cannot be double counted towards a company's progress to net zero. So I think that's sort of what you've just answered with how you've described it in terms of jurisdictional red.
I think you're right. I think there is a transition period, though, for some countries, as I mentioned in my presentation, before they have the ability to do a corresponding adjustment and say, right, you are free to use this mitigation outcome against your carbon neutrality or your net zero claim, corporate that's funded that project. There will be arguments that say, look, the first part of what you said, the host country always owns the mitigation outcome. It gets reflected in their inventory. The ability to account it in somebody else's account is controlled by the country. And if a corporate doesn't have an account at the UNFCCC level and doesn't give their purchased credits to their domicile, if you're a US company, there is an argument that can be made that a corresponding adjustment isn't necessary to prevent double counting at the UNFCCC level. But I'll go back to the word that I used a little earlier, intentionality. And this is a view that I know is close to gold standard's heart, and that is we really need to get economy-wide NDCs that in absolute terms where every aspect of the economy is covered by some policy, some regulation, if we really are going to deliver on the Paris Agreement. When we get to that point, you can't prove additionality without making a corresponding adjustment. So it is inevitable as we improve the system that we need to get ready to apply corresponding adjustments if we're going to have a well-functioning voluntary carbon market exist alongside and as a valued complement to the compliance market.
And I think that is a very good answer to another question that we're going to ask, which is, so while the corresponding adjustment mechanism is still being worked out, what to expect for future projects that create carbon credits? Has the VCS gold standard come out with a statement about this? And I think that's exactly the point you made. The gold standard has said, and I think all the standards are agreed on that transition. That is where we're going to get some gold standard perhaps moving more rapidly than some of the other standards towards that, but all on that trajectory towards
Indeed.
That intent.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that gold standard has set a date by which they will require corresponding adjustments. So putting pressure, it's almost becoming a campaigning standard saying, we know this is what we want, we should really encourage it. Vera, which had a very useful webinar yesterday on their position, is saying corresponding adjustments are clearly going to be playing a very important role. When they are available for projects, we will flag them in our registry. That gives corporates the option of choosing a carbon credit that has a corresponding adjustment or a commitment to having one, and one without. And then the VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Initiative, I think is going to provide very valuable and much needed guidance as to what you can claim with the use of what instrument.
Thank you. Now, we've only got 2 minutes left, and all the questions, I think, have quite long answers. So I'm going to try one, which I hope you can answer quickly, which is sort of into also what you just said. So do you feel that the outcome of COP has given projects, which are obviously fundamental to what we do, the projects which are delivering those emissions reductions and avoided emissions and delivering that impact right now, has it given them some clarity of what to expect in the future, do you feel?
I think of all the actors, project developers probably still facing the most uncertainty. 6.4, the successor to the CDM, hasn't been developed. The transition plans for corresponding adjustments remain, work in progress. It does make it difficult for project developers, which takes me back to my previous comment, which is, no matter how difficult it is, we must keep our eye on the prize, which is finance for impact. And if the rules aren't particularly clear, we need transparency. We're going to do our best under the circumstances. We're going to be open about what we are able to achieve, but we need to keep moving.
Brilliant. I'm not going to fire any of these other questions at you because I think it would be extraordinary if you could answer them in the 30 seconds we have left. So with that, I am going to thank you very much, Jonathan. This webinar will be available, the recording of this webinar will be available to everyone who attended. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends and partners. And we'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us, and wish all of our colleagues, partners, clients and attendees in the US a very happy Thanksgiving. And
I'm going to second that. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.